Hello and welcome to HFMA Talk, the podcast for NHS Finance. I'm Mark Orchard, Chief Financial Officer at Portsmouth Hospitals University NHS Trust. This episode continues our series of conversations where I get to talk with my current and former NHS colleagues, working across all sectors and geographies, right across the UK and beyond. If you're enjoying listening to this new series so far, you'll be doing me a great favour if you were to spread the word amongst your colleagues and friends, and also on your social media platforms. And most importantly, please do remember to hit the subscribe button on your podcast app to subscribe to HFMA Talk so that you never miss an episode. Now, today, I have the great privilege of being joined by the head of the NHS finance profession for the whole of England, National Chief Financial Officer of NHS England and NHS Improvement, Julian Kelly. Julian, very warm welcome to the podcast today. How are you on this gloriously sunny Friday afternoon?
I'm doing well, Mark, and thanks for having me. As you say, gloriously sunny here in London as well, and thank goodness it's Friday.
Now, one of the things that struck me, Julian, in preparing for this conversation is actually, I don't think your wider career story is that well known to the majority of colleagues within the NHS sector. So if you just indulge me for a moment. So you graduated in modern languages at Trinity College, Oxford.
Yep.
You joined a generalist civil service fast stream and were approached quickly by the Treasury, where you then spent the first 12 years or so of your career in a range of roles that included selling gold as part of foreign exchange reserves, designing tax credits, covering the Home Office budget, and you spent, as part of that period, 2 years, I think, in the city as well. And during that time, you must have qualified as a chartered accountant, I'm guessing, and that's where you obviously got your CIMA qualification during that period. Then in 2007, you joined the UK Border Agency as Finance Director, where you would go on to stay for the next 4 years. And in the latter part of that, of course, you worked for Rob Whiteman as Chief Executive. And Rob, as we'll know, many of us will know, a friend of the HFMA family, who of course went on and is still the Chief Executive of CIPFA.
So, Mark, just a couple of details actually just worth even clarifying now in terms of the story, because broadly what you've said is right. And I did spend the first 12 years of my career largely as a generalist in Her Majesty's Treasury, with a couple of years in the city in that time. But actually, I didn't get qualified during that period.
Wow.
So in the in the last 4 years of that period, it was like 2003 through to 2007, I ran the team in the Treasury that looked after the Home Office, what was then, is now the Ministry of Justice, and the Attorney General's Department. So everything to do with the law, criminal justice, police, prisons, negotiating budgets, etc. And at that point, the head of the government finance function kind of made the policy decision that if you wanted to be the finance director of a government department, you needed to be qualified. Now, prior to that, you hadn't needed to be qualified. And I was part of a bit of a team that was working on how did we improve finance across government at that point in time. Now, having spent 12 years in the Treasury, where you largely pontificate about how other people should do their jobs better, I thought I should actually roll up my sleeves and work out what does it really take to make stuff happen. Now, so this is a long-winded story, but at that point, I was approached by the then Chief Executive of a bit of the Home Office, which at the time was called the Immigration and Nationality Directorate. And she said, why don't you come and be what was basically the deputy CFO, and why don't you get qualified at the same time? So I went to do my first real operational finance job, running the finances for what then became the UK Border Agency. But I got qualified during that period. And so I got qualified at that point because I thought, well, it'll open options up. All right. So that's actually when I got qualified. I got qualified whilst actually creating the finance function for the UK Border Agency.
Wow, well, that's even more interesting. I made an assumption that you were already qualified at that point, as you quite rightly corrected. So thank you for that. So, UK Border Agency, Finance Director, where you qualified. Fantastic. You then went on to spend 5 years, which I'll come back to actually later on if we can, between 2012 and 2017, initially as Director, and then most significantly as Director General of Public Spending and Finance. And then, of course, what we all got to hear before you joined NHS England and Improvement was that you'd spent then the 2 years in between that role and the NHS England Improvement role as Director General Nuclear, leading the Defence Nuclear Organisation at the Ministry of Defence, responsible, as I understand, Julian, for nuclear deterrent in its many aspects, including Britain's nuclear submarines, nuclear warheads, and everything else, sort of day-to-day policy and planning. So, and all before you joined NHS INE. So, wow, what a packed CV. You're still looking quite young on it. I just wonder, when you set out early on in your career, what, if any, career plan you had, and kind of how that's played out, really.
I've never had a career plan, all right? You know, from the moment when, in the February of my final year at university, when I suddenly thought, oh no, I've actually got to go and find a job. What on earth am I going to do? And I applied for 2 jobs. I was studying French and Spanish, as you said, and I applied to L'Oreal because I thought, well, it's business, it's French, I love French, I'll apply for that. And then at the same time, I found the civil service application form. And in the year I applied to do the fast stream in the civil service, all you had to do was write your name, address, qualifications, and fill in a multiple choice psychometric questionnaire. So I thought, well, what have I got to lose? That's so easy. So I applied for the civil service. Now, L'Oreal and I worked out we weren't really fit for each other, like in the final stage of the process. That was the right answer by them. But I got into the civil service. I hadn't thought about applying for the Treasury, but the Treasury approached me. So I decided, well, it was the choice of the Northern Ireland office, what is now the Office of National Statistics, or the Treasury. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem like a hard answer. So I joined the Treasury, despite the fact I don't think I really knew what they did. And one of the key features of my career, if I'm completely honest, is that people have asked me to do things through my career at various times, or have approached me. And a lot of my personal decision making has been people approaching me at the right moment when I'm thinking maybe I'm ready for a new challenge. And my question has always been, gosh, well, am I interested? Does that sound fun? Do I think it would stretch me? Right. And basically, so I've never had a career plan. I've sort of followed a line of, at various points, thinking, me just thinking, gosh, I feel like I'm ready for a new challenge. And then often at that point, someone has approached me about an opportunity, and, it's ticked those boxes and off I've gone. I mean, in the very early years of the Treasury, there's sort of a grad scheme, and there's sort of a rotation that you follow and apply for things. And again, it's just, does that job sound interesting? But I then went to the City because I'd just done a project working for a guy who had been the CFO for BAE Systems, really senior businessman. And I just learned something. He's had such a different mentality. And I just thought, gosh, before I just commit myself full time to the public sector, I found working with him, it stretched me. It gave me a completely different way of thinking about things. I should go and I should go and get a bit more of that in the private sector. So I went to the City. I spent 2 years in the City, and I thought, I've loved this. I found it fascinating. I've learnt loads, but I'm not that motivated to make money. For other people, I was working for an investment bank, or necessarily for myself, and somewhere that motivation had to be in you. And I realized I love public policy. So I came back to the Treasury. I ended up being given a job. That was the Home Office job. And then after doing it for 4 years, and I was just thinking, what am I going to do next? And at that point, Lynn Homer, the chief exec, doing immigration and so on, as I said, because I had worked a lot with her, approached me and said, well, look, would you be interested? And she said, why don't you get qualified? So I thought, well, I knew it'd be good to roll up my sleeves, really work out what does it take to make stuff happen. So I went and did it, right? But after 4 years there, I thought, gosh, I do love being in central government. I do love working in the Treasury. I went back to talk to my former boss, who said, well, actually, it'd be great if you came back. I actually went back to be the FD of the Treasury, which is actually a really quite small organisation, always with a view, and he had a view, look, I've got other thoughts, but just come back, right? And that's when I then went to do public spending. And it's like by pure serendipity, the combination of I'd run spending teams in the Treasury, I'd done it. I'd been out there, I'd done operational finance, I was qualified. So to him, that ticked, we got on, he thought I was reasonable at the job. He gave me the job doing the Director of Public Spending. Okay, so it's sort of serendipity and being asked. And then there was a point where about 2 years in, there was a discussion about how they're going to run like the government finance function. And for various reasons, the head of the government finance function at the time was actually Richard Douglas, who was at that point the DG Finance for the Department of Health.
That's right.
And the general thrust was a real desire to bring responsibility for public spending and the government finance function back into the Treasury and join it up as a single role, which it never had been. But it just so happened that they thought that was possible because I was one of the very few Treasury people who was qualified at that level, had the operational experience, and was kind of had a big chunk and was kind of holding public spending. So it's like one of those sort of serendipitous moments. And maybe that's just too much the story of my career. Because even when I went to the MOD, I'd done that job for 5 years. I'd done the public spending job one way or another for 5 years. We'd been doing austerity in essence. The government had just changed. They'd just lost the referendum. You could tell things were going to change. And the plan that I'd been part of constructing, and once it's tied into, I'd done the job for 5 years. There's a lot of frankly saying no at the time. And I was like, look, everything's changing. I could do with the change. And probably you need someone new now to come in and take on this job for the next phase. And I was phoned up Christmas Eve out of the blue by the guy who ran the Ministry of Defence, who said, well, do you want to come and do, I've been talking to the Cabinet Secretary. We're looking for someone to kind of come and look after the nuclear deterrent. We haven't found that person yet, but would you be interested? And again, I just thought, well, that would be fascinating. That could be fun. Boy, that's going to be challenging. Yes. All right. So roll on 2 years. It's worth saying when I was leaving the Treasury, or when I was thinking about the Treasury, I was thinking, right, I've run all public spending. I've been the head of the government finance function. I don't want to go and be like an FD of a department. What is the point of that? But I did think the only finance job in the country I'd actually still be interested in doing is if they created a CFO for the NHS. Now, at the time, that role didn't really exist in that way. I mean, we had two great individuals in Paul Baumann and Elizabeth Omani who were doing the kind of E&I roles, great individuals who left me a great legacy. But the job didn't exist. And it was Richard Douglas, actually, who was then a NED in the kind of I&E world, who phoned me up and said, Julian, we're thinking of creating this job. Would you be interested? And I just thought, well, that's the one finance job in the country I thought I might still be interested in doing. And I just thought it was too good an opportunity to turn down. All right. On the grounds that I thought, gosh, that'd be fun. It'll be stretching. I think I can get into that mission. My family's got a lot of health background. My dad was a surgeon. My brother's a consultant pediatrician. My sister's a nurse. So I've got a lot of the kind of NHS heritage. And I just thought, well, it ticks those boxes. Why don't I, let's throw my hat in the ring. So I've never really had a career plan. It's just the right things. Is it going to be fun? Is it going to be stretching? And by and large, do I think it opens options up rather than closes options down? I think that has been, and then serendipity, has been my career plan.
That's fascinating, Julian. And there's so many things I want to come back to in what you just unpacked, or would like to unpack, if that's all right. But let's go back to your role then. So you're at the Treasury. You're Director General of Public Spending, and then Government Review and a newly created role brings that together with the Head of Government Finance Profession. And I think this is the time when I first became aware of you. So in parallel with that sort of time period, within the NHS under Paul Bowman's leadership, but also with Richard Douglas, Bob Alexander at the time, and a whole bunch of other senior leaders, because the NHS was quite fragmented at that time, as you said. We were working on how do we get the best of the NHS finance function within a quite fragmented environment at that time, and we embarked on something that later became Future Focus Finance at that time. And it was Richard that connected me and some senior colleagues at the time supporting me to the work that you were leading on around the central government or the wider government programme for training and development and so on. So, and I think for me, that's where I kind of like to just draw some parallels with the later work you come on to when you're now leading for the NHS. But can you just say a bit more about that wider programme within that sector at that time and some of the parallels maybe that you would like to see brought into the NHS, if that's okay?
Yeah, so we did and tried to do several things at that point. Number one, they pulled the finance and public spending together so that actually they really harnessed together like the actual function, managing the money, delivering the value, with some of the rules and policies that went with it, what was our accounting framework, and who have we got doing it? So one of the things we put a lot of effort into at that time was the development of people doing finance across government and talent management. So were we spotting the people across all the government departments and agencies as far as we could? And were we identifying those who we wanted to pull through, all right, into senior roles? And we did a load of work to really map out our talent and start discussing as a group of, at the time, like 30, 40 FDs across government to say, okay, which of these people are our future FDs? And we're going to take someone who's working in the courts and we're going to go and give them an opportunity in defence, because that's the next role. They're the right person. And we're going to start moving people about and offering them opportunities so we could start to pull through our talent, and that we could really think about it from the perspective of, we knew we were underrepresented by, all the same issues, right? Gender, ethnicity, disability, the other protected characteristics, right? So let's think, who are those people and how do we start offering opportunities? Where do we take risk? And in fact, the lady, Kat Little, who is now doing my job, she's now doing the job I used to do in the Treasury, who is now the head of the government finance function and the head of public spending, is a great example of someone who came in and we were talking to and saying, look, you are really good, right? What's the next opportunity? What's the next opportunity? Opportunity, so that she now finds herself sort of running the whole show. So we did loads of work on talent management. We did quite a lot of work, very similar to what you were trying to do on the Finance Academy around the future focus finance of, can we begin to develop a common curriculum and sort of common learning and development opportunities. We started to design a common target operating model. Right, so like, what should the operating model be? What should the shape of a finance function be across all the government departments that is then fed into the sort of government shared services agenda? Now, there'll be parallels you could think about here. I think the NHS is a bigger, actually more complicated beast to entirely do that. But one of the things we want to explore with the innovation agenda is, okay, but what can we learn? And where are there common things we should all be, actually adopting in a standardized way? So the thing I don't think we did in that job, but we're trying to do here through the work that Simon Worthington is leading is, okay, but now how do we connect? And how do we really draw the inspiration and energy from the 15,000, people who are working? And how do we start to connect and draw the inspiration with the clinicians and how do we engage them on this question of value? And I don't think we did as much of that in the government as we are trying to contemplate now within the NHS.
Let's go on to talk about One NHS Finance, but I think it was important just to recognise the work you led on for that period in your head of government finance profession role, because I think that gives good amount of context in terms of what your ambitions are for now. So let's go on and talk about One NHS Finance then. And Julian, again, just recalling events as I was just preparing myself for this conversation. One of the most powerful things, and it might not have felt that powerful from your perspective, but from my perspective, and I'm sure colleagues listening, one of the most powerful signals you gave when you joined the NHS was when you organised, pre-COVID of course, for the whole of the NHS Finance Director and Chief Financial Officer community to come together. And we spent a good deal of time, it was a single agenda item in effect, a good deal of time, all morning, I recall, talking about how we, and in a structured way, how we would consider together the future of the NHS finance function, how we develop that for the future. Building on the work that had been done previously around future-focused finance, but actually grasping that and taking forward. You then went on, obviously, despite the pandemic, to have a conversation with the whole of the NHS finance community in England in one conversation about its future as well. So I suppose my question is, what does one NHS finance mean to you, Julian? What are you hoping and aspiring to get from that, beyond some of the obvious products and specifics around it? But what's your level of ambition for this programme of work?
I mean, my take is the NHS finance function has community, let's put it that way, has one of the most important jobs in the country, right? Because we are responsible for managing 150 billion, well, actually slightly more, £1 billion of taxpayers' money, and delivering the service that touches, everyone in the country, basically, at some point, or indeed many points in their lives. And you think, given that across the country, even in lots of individual organisations, we are basically doing the same job. You think we must be better if we can harness our combined energy, experience, capability than if we're all kind of working in our individual patches. It must be that we can actually do our job better. And if the whole thrust of where we're going with integrated systems is also we're not in competition, right? We're not here for the provider to do over the commissioner or the commissioner to do over the private. It's no, guys, we've got a taxpayer pound. What is the best way of us kind of using that money to deliver the outcomes for patients? So again, what can we do to cultivate a spirit which is, no, we're in this together, and to share and combine the kind of knowledge, wisdom, expertise, capability that, I have seen exist in spades across the NHS, and to learn how we can stop all reinventing the wheel. Because, there is a lot of networking, but you can see people are, reinventing bits of the wheel. So this is not an overnight game, but how do we take that step forward? And it's why we talk about one NHS finance. And I don't talk about a function, I talk about a community. Because we're not one organisation. Let's recognise that. But how can we strengthen how we work as a community so that we're greater than the sum of our parts?
What are you looking for beyond that community? What are the sort of tangible things you're looking at making step changes on as we embark on this programme, Julian?
I actually think at a system and region level, we should be looking at our talent. And it's much harder for the NHS to do it completely at a national level. But there are aspects I think we should actually be doing at a national level. But at least at system and region, who are the people we've got? Where is the talent? How are we going to bring that talent through? In a similar way to the way I described the way we did it and have done it in government. Because my honest experience was we ended up in a better place, and we did a lot to improve actually our diversity, equality and inclusion through so we were both stronger and more representative, and those two sort of fed off each other. So that'd be thing one. Thing two would be, it must be that there are elements of common training and development we can develop and should be offering, right? Rather than everyone inventing it for themselves. And actually, if you can partner with some of the national organisations you mentioned, SIPFA, with Rob or SEAM or HFMA or, as per this podcast, how do you combine the kind of effort and resource so you can offer world-class training to people from across the NHS? Then this doesn't just require one NHS Finance, but I think one NHS Finance can be a powerful vehicle. All right. How do we just keep establishing that culture of value for money? Now, extraordinary work has gone on across the years. This is not me coming in with something new. But okay, what are the next steps to us doing that? And we've been through a really extraordinary period where, frankly, we took the brakes off. And we know we're going to have to get some of that discipline back. And some of your FD colleagues have said how hard that is right now. But okay, what can we do in the kind of value makers program, the engagement with clinicians? Okay, how do we do that bottom up, as well as, you know, through the sort of normal channels? And then, as I said, there is lots of innovation going on, and the whole move more generally in the world towards, you know, robotic process automation, AI, better use of data. I mean, I don't know, you know, whatever those things are and more, there are pockets of that going on across the whole of the NHS. Well, you definitely see people are reinventing it. You definitely, some people are making all of those, you know, are making the connections and learning. Well, surely if we come together, we can accelerate that process without that being top-down diktat or anything else. But it's like coming together and working out, okay, what are the answers?
What would be your message to the likes of me and colleagues then in terms of how we maximise and play our part to achieve the vision that you just set out?
So I think my headline message would be get engaged, right? There are bits of the country where engagement, I think, is really strong. And by the way, it's building on exactly what people have gone before and done, right? It's like the financial skill development networks or the HFMA branches, the work of future focused finance, right? You can see that has really taken hold, but it hasn't taken hold kind of uniformly or universally, right? So how do we create the strength of those networks across the whole country? So thing one is get engaged. And if your region or finance director is not putting you together, all right, or if you think your branch doesn't exist, can you come and find us? Can you shout? Because then we need to go and do something about it, get engaged at a system level, get engaged at a regional level. And then we've begun to pull some networks together nationally, and they're going to be kind of reaching in and asking, you know, people for ideas and help and whatever else. So thing one is get engaged. Thing two is get your staff engaged. Now, again, loads of you as FDs are already doing this. But I would say, come on, how do we get the energy from our staff? I mean, as I said, I've talked about Simon up in Leeds a few times, but people like him, yourself, others, you're doing this fantastically. Let's get the energy and ideas of our staff, because this is about how they can help shape what you're doing within an organization as well as within a system, right? And then we can also learn nationally. So get engaged, get your staff engaged.
Thank you, Julie. That's really, really powerful stuff. I'm going to take you back then to something you touched on earlier on, is when the point you joined the NHS. So just over 2 years ago now, you've already started to articulate some of your motivations, I think, around that, given sort of family ties and how the NHS touches all of us. I suppose then the question I'd really like to ask you then is how has that couple of years been? Because you've joined us at a time when you wouldn't have known when you joined us. None of us would have known we were going to go into a global pandemic, right? So it's been an absolute whirlwind of a few years. So I'd be interested in, as much from an individual personal perspective, how that's felt coming into a new sector in the role you're in, and then having to deal with everything you've had to deal with and continue to have to deal with, by the way, to get us through to the next stage. So what does it feel like, Julian? How's it been?
Look, it's clearly been an absolutely extraordinary experience, but we've all lived through, the last 18 months. I mean, joining the NHS, so I joined just as they brought NHS England and NHS Improvement together. So the challenge of the first year was basically an almost entirely new team, all right, coming together within NHS England and Improvement. So the challenge of new team, new organisation coming together, added to, completely new to the sector. But I'm clearly used to dealing with large numbers. As someone said, how do you deal with scale? You just move the decimal point. But I'm clearly used to and reasonably comfortable dealing with large numbers. But the real challenge that first year was just the learning curve, right? The scale, complexity, variety of the NHS. It's just sort of getting up that learning curve. And at the time, we had some decisions to make about what we were thinking about the future architecture of the kind of NHS finances at that point, getting to grips with how we sort of recapitalized the finances of the NHS, because clearly they had been deteriorating over time, and how we set off on the right foot for sort of delivering the long-term plan. So like the first year was personally I found really challenging for all of those reasons. And just as I began to feel, okay, maybe I'm sort of getting my head around this, we hit the pandemic. And I remember vividly, I don't know, one weekend in March when basically we knew, right, we've got to rip the financial rule book up, and by Monday we need to know what our new answer is. And actually, I credit Sandra Easton with basically that weekend working out what we should do, which has been the basis of actually how we've run for the last 18 months. In essence, to say, well, we're definitely not about to spend less money. So the thing we've actually got to do is just fix how much money we're currently spending and give people that. Just give them certainty. All those thoughts and thinking we've been doing is like, okay, let's just rip all of that up. We are just about to overnight redesign this whole thing. And then over about a month, I mean, the hours were crazy, but just, right, we're going to design the enhanced discharge scheme and go get agreement to do it. We're going to nationalise the contracts for the independent sector. That over a month. And again, actually, Sandra Easton and a guy called Neil Permain basically negotiated that one weekend. You just just redesigning everything. And then, of course, it's okay, how do you keep just working out what's the next thing you need to do as you went through COVID and the pandemic? Then, the phase which was, okay, last summer, how do we set some kind of system as we try and restore services, which we got quite a lot of flack for in various ways at the time. And then the next half, which is, gosh, we are going to have some future winter wave, but how do we now begin to just put some of the financial discipline back in, right? So let's reestablish a budget. And right now we're in that phase of how do we keep restoring some financial discipline? How do we, though, agree the money with government that, though it just enables things to keep going and us to recover services, when we've sort of thrown most of the NHS up in the air over the last year? And how do we plan for the next 3 and 4 years? So, it's definitely been the toughest 2 years of my working life, but it helps working with some amazing individuals, great colleagues. And then personally, just finding, I'm a Christian, so actually prayer is pretty important to me. Exercise, so running has been pretty important to me. And managing to stop, actually just drawing a line at points and just going, do you know what? Of course I could keep going. But do you know what? We've just got to stop. I've actually got to go pay attention to my family.
So Sandra Easton was a guest on this podcast just a few months ago and described that weekend, the weekend that I think you're talking about in probably mid-March, where, as you say, the rule book's ripped up, and I guess quite liberating from one angle, but in hindsight, quite scary at the time, I'm sure. But equally, Julian, I guess there's a lot that you want to take from that period in terms of the agile ways of working, and actually, it's okay to change the rules and to move forward in a different way to suit the environment and the context we're currently working in. So what's some of the positives you take out of that you'd like to maybe hang on to before we just focus on reinstalling all the financial discipline and, dare I say, a lot of the rules that we had in place before we went into the pandemic?
Well, of course, it really makes you think, exactly as you've just said, how can you hold on to some of that speed of decision making? Honest to God, of course it gets harder when people have time to think, right? Or you're trying to get things agreed through government and people suddenly think, okay, they've got time to ask 1,000 questions. But how do we hold on to some of that speed of decision making? How do we stay focused on, it's a good reminder, isn't it? What's our objective? What we're actually trying to achieve? It gives me some encouragement sometimes to be bold. And of course, it also makes you think, look, in the end, you've got to try and get money to people that releases them to get on and think about, but to do the right thing, right? And I think, how do we hold on to some of that spirit? And I know that is not always easy as you're trying to work out decision-making, government, national NHS, system, local, that thing of how do you allow people to sort of get on, it's that sort of tight loose framework.
So give us a bit of insight, if you could, in terms of, and this podcast is not really about the technicalities or sort of a news briefing of any sort of sense, but just give us a bit of sense in terms of how you see us moving forward in the second half of the year, and indeed more longer term, perhaps into next year. Around, when do you think we'll resemble something that feels more like a normal NHS level of expenditure? And what, is that? Do you think that's next year, or restoring NHS elective activity, particularly? Do you think we're on an even longer?
The government has to decide what does it want to achieve over the next 3 and 4 years, and what's the investment that's going to be required to achieve that. Okay, now I think that's what it has to work out. It's going to have to work it out. In fact, it is working it out, in reasonably tight timescales, but it has got to work that out. And then, our job is to explain what it would really take. And the challenge at the moment is being honest. It is working out the right balance of the kind of, we've put a lot of cost in. I mean, we've seen a big productivity drop for the cost we've put in. I mean, it's probably about 10 to 15% at the moment. So we honestly have got to recover that. It's going to require us to come through the pandemic. It's going to require some of the constraints we're living with to shift. But we have got to recover that. But it's like, what is a reasonable period of time over which that can be recovered? That's the judgment. And then alongside it, what's the investment you're going to have to put in if you want to deal with some of the backlogs of care that we currently have or anticipate will have? And so in some ways, I'm just outlining like what's almost the equation we are working through. I don't have exactly the answer, but look, as we go through the back half of this year and into next year, things are going to feel tighter financially. But kind of quite how that balance plays out, that's what the government is going to have to decide. That is the conversation that we are sort of in with them. And the challenge, I think, right now, even for the finance function, is, okay, honestly, as you look at things, what are the costs we have put in that will either fall out, or we do need to be thinking, oh no, we can change that now. We can actually take that cost out. We can actually, with working with the clinicians and management, work out, okay, there are ways in which we can put productivity, back in, and somehow it's creating the space, right, for people to do that, because it's incredibly hard to have the space for people, honestly, to work that stuff out as we sit here today. If, no doubt, Mark, for you in Portsmouth or people elsewhere in the country, if you actually look at what's going on in your emergency department and on the ward. So it's how do we create that space?
And I deliberately got into the conversation around One NHS Finance before this conversation, because actually, it'd be very easy to see, wouldn't it, that the One NHS Finance work programme, all that stuff about community and talent development and everything else, was sort of a nice to do, a sort of over here, when actually all the challenge that you've just described is something sort of happening different on a different plane. But actually, the One NHS Finance, harnessing that community, trying to solve problems once rather than 1,000 times across the country and so on, really gives us a way into trying to accelerate some of how we navigate our way through this, I guess, isn't it? So really important, I think, that we see that as not something that's optional, and something about actually how we get the best from the sum of our parts in order to deliver on the challenge that you just outlined.
Yeah, and even as we go through like what's immediate in front of our noses, we have still got to keep thinking about the medium and long term. Like it's why the talent stuff matters, right? Because we need to put ourselves in a stronger position when we hand the baton on to whoever succeeds us, Mark in your role or me in mine, and not entirely let the urgent squeeze out the really important.
So listen, mindful of time, Julian. Let's get into some quick fire stuff, because that might just unpack a few other bits I wanted to draw out. So I'm going to ask you a few questions. You haven't got to expand on your answers. You can if you want to. Just first thing that comes in your head, really. But just a chance for us to get behind the person behind the role, if that makes sense, Julian. So first one, question I've asked quite a few times, and I've got some illuminating answers. But what would be your perfect weekend?
Getting up really reasonably early on a Saturday, either going for a run with my daughter And then my wife and I often make Saturday mornings, that's our date time, right? That is the time when we just get out, have a coffee, go for a walk, just be together before inevitably you've got to do some of the admin. Then on a Sunday, playing tennis with a friend who I've played tennis with for 25 years, and then just time with family, church, family, friends. That is a good standard weekend, if it isn't just being away up on top of a mountain somewhere.
When was the last time you laughed out loud?
Sunday was the Euro final on Sunday.
Don't tell me you laughed at the result. Surely not.
No. We were in my garden, so outside, but with some of my daughter's fiance, cousin, friends, their age, and just the hilarity of watching them react through the final. That was my last complete laugh out loud moment. Clearly the result was very sad. But like during the actual final itself, that was my that was my last complete laugh out loud moment. In particular, watching my future to be son-in-law react through the whole of the final. That was priceless.
Julian, who or what inspires you?
Who or what inspires me? It's kind of obvious through this conversation. My faith is pretty important to me, and people will come from many different backgrounds. But that, for me, Jesus is a big inspiration. But then, it's individuals who I've sort of come across. Be it, my parents or various others who I have just found their love, compassion, service just genuinely inspiring.
Excellent. And finally, in terms of the quick fire round, Julian, what are you most proud of in terms of what you might have achieved over your career so far?
I find that an almost impossible question to answer, to say I'm most proud of something, if I'm honest. The thing that you really get proud of, particularly doing this kind of role, is working with your teams, and you see what they manage to achieve, right? And I remember when I left the UK Border Agency, we just managed to do some really incredible stuff in terms of actually delivering much improved value. And you realised you were just part of a team, who'd worked unbelievably hard. And I look over the last year, and I look at what the team, I've been responsible for, worked with, have actually done. That's the stuff that kind of really makes me proud. So I find it hard to pull out one thing, if I'm honest, Mark. But the fact that I've worked with a bunch of people who have actually done their bit with everybody else to kind of just try and keep the NHS on some sort of even keel as we go through, and then try and work out what the next 3 and 4 steps are down the line. I feel pretty proud of what the guys have done.
Excellent, Julian. What a great way to end this podcast. I think that's it's been a fascinating conversation. I've certainly learned a lot. I hope some of our listeners have learned a lot as well. I suppose I just might, if I may, just invite you to, there's a lot of people going to be listening to this podcast at all levels of seniority across NHS finance, across England and across the UK indeed. All probably feeling quite fatigued given what we've been through. And I wonder if there's a message that you wanted to send to finance professionals across our community.
I think there are 2 things I would say. I remember thinking probably about this time last year, gosh, the really hard bit is about to come. Because the really hard bit is actually how you came out of COVID, in a funny way, because it's putting things back together is so much more complicated. But so let's all just recognise the challenge that we have both asked of people and will still be asking, right? Because it's not. I don't think it's about to get easier. But 2, just enormous thanks, and people should actually reflect on what they have achieved. There are moments when you do need to look back and think, wow, we have actually done quite an extraordinary job. So I would just ask people just to look back on what you've achieved over the last 15 months And in one sense, just give yourselves a pat on the back if you haven't already, or as teams do, like just recognize what you have done. And 3, then as we face the challenges to come, there was a chief exec on a call that I was on earlier this week who said, I do remind myself that every day we make 8,000 people's lives better in some way or other. It might be obvious, but I don't think it's always obvious as you're grinding out the accounts, right, which have been hard this year, or as you're working out the planning ask that we are no doubt going to give. Just hold in mind, why on earth am I doing this? Because we are trying to make every day the thousands of people, the millions of people who walk through our door, we are trying to help make their lives better. So just hold on to the kind of goal, and the contribution that the people listening or who are working for us, like what they are putting towards that.
Julian, thank you so much. And to everyone listening in, thank you for choosing HFMA Talk. And as I said at the start, if you are enjoying listening to this new In Conversation series, please do spread the word as well as subscribing to HFMA Talk on your podcast app. And if there's anyone that you would like me to have a conversation with next, then do get in touch via policy@hfma.org.uk. But until next time, goodbye.